Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray, and this is the last Risky Business Weekly episode for 2024. What a year it has been, and we're going out with a bang because we actually launched our new website last week. Head on over to risky.biz, and instead of just seeing a horrible kind of joke website that looks kind of like it's just an RSS feed, you're actually going to be able to find all of the work from the Risky Business team there, including written work, podcasts, videos, all in the one place. We're pretty proud of it. So yeah, head on over to risky.biz. I should say thank you as well to Dave Snellgrove, who is the designer, also to Dylan O'Donnell, who did a lot of the front-end web dev work, and some jerk who did all of the back-end work, by the name of Adam Boileau, who's been slaving away recoding our content management system over the last few months and did a wonderful job. But it's nice to have that done, isn't it, Adam?
It is. It was very nice because I was the one who mostly interacted with it these days because you had PTSD from our old content management system, I very quickly understood why. So
yes,
there's a little bit of rip and replace to go on there.
Yeah. After 18 years of being the person who posted all of the content into the Risky Business content management system, that was the first thing when you came on full time. I said, I don't want to do this ever again, basically. So thank you for that. This week's show is brought to you by Spectorops, which of course, they are both a services and a product company. They make Bloodhound Enterprise based on their open source Bloodhound software project, which is a really great way to do identity attack path mapping through organizations. And it started off just for Active Directory, but now it does a whole bunch of stuff. But today we're talking more about the services side of Spectorops. Robbie Winchester works on the services side over there, and he's going to be joining us to talk about how pen testing has changed. And it really, really has. These days, it's less about trying to, send someone a malicious executable and pop a shell that way. It's getting increasingly identity-centric, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in that interview. So I do hope you will all stick around for that one. But mate, let's get into the news now. And we're going to start off with a brief write-up on Cybersecurity Dive from Matt Capco, looking at the SEC cyber incident reporting rule, right? Which everybody said was either going to result in people covering breaches up or, just a deluge of meaningless reports. And basically, no, it hasn't really worked out like that at all. There's been 71 filings over the last 11 months, and most of them are just people saying, well, we had an incident. I don't know if it's material, so it hasn't quite turned into the disaster that people said it was going to be, where, oh my God, it's going to eat all of our time and we're all going to go to prison for not appropriately disclosing incidents. And it's just turned into, hardly anything's happened with this so far.
Yeah, and the quality of the information it's collecting, there's some kind of questions about the utility of it. There's quite a lot of pretty generic words, in these
boilerplate language in an SEC filing? No,
so,
no, that would never happen.
I mean, it's not a fire hose of disasters like we, kind of half expected, and at the same time,
kind of half hoped for.
I mean, we do love a good disaster fire hose around here, but it's also like, is it helpful for investors to make meaningful choices about how they invest? I don't know that it meets that bar either. So, it's.
Well, we did see, you remember earlier this year, we saw the SEC sort of come out and say, issue a bit of guidance saying, well, if you haven't determined it's material, you don't kind of need to do the filing. So, I feel like this has, there was so much hype about this, like it was going to be the worst thing ever and onerous and whatever, and it just hasn't turned out that way. But I mean, let's see. I mean, maybe next year the SEC starts going nuts and cracking down or something. I don't see it happening, actually. I think this is a fairly basic requirement that's, that's just working out about how probably the SEC expected it to.
Yeah, we do see people keeping an eye on those filings. We've certainly covered a few reports, in the news of people that have been breached that we found out through their, the 8K filings that they have to do. So, it has some utility for people like us.
Yeah.
But for investors, I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. We've got some US politicians looking at they're looking to investigate and, they're calling for accountability over the Exxon Mobil sort of hacking allegations that we talked about last week. This is where Exxon apparently used their lobbyists to gather information on protesters and whatnot, and they then in turn outsourced it to some private investigator who then bought a bunch of, allegedly bought a bunch of hacking for hire services out of India to like pop these people's mailboxes and, leak damaging information, whatever. Real dirty, dirty stuff that you expect to see in movies, not in real life. But, it looks like a couple of sort of powerful, senators and whatnot are looking at this and saying, no, we got to do something about this, which is good. This is a response you want.
Yeah, it is. I mean, obviously, of course, the publicity firm that Exxon used and Exxon themselves has said, like, we didn't do it. It wasn't us. We have nothing. We would never commission hacking. But
we would commission a private investigator who might do that.
Yes,
for us. But we have no idea.
So, yeah, I some accountability seems like it would be natural. Like that seems natural justice to have some kind of accountability for this. Whether that will actually happen, I'm not super confident about. But, it's nice to see them getting a bit of heat for it, because at the very least, it might give other people, the slightest amount of pause before they do the same sorts of things.
Yeah, so we've got the Senate Budget Chairman Sheldon Whitehouse, natural born politician with a name like that. Yeah. Saying in a statement that, we need to take a good long look at Exxon and its fellow fossil fuel flunkies. There we go. And I think Ron Wyden's in there as well, and a Democrat from California, Rokana, talking about that one. So, yeah, I mean, hopefully we see some comeuppance.
Yes.
For Exxon, but the incoming administration is not exactly hostile towards oil companies, so I don't expect it to be a top priority.
Probably not. No.
Yeah, for the White House at least. But anyway, now let's take a look at this report from the New York Times, which, sigh. The headline is Biden administration takes first step to retaliate against China over hack, and that is not what is happening here. So it's by David Sanger over at the Times. The lead paragraph reads, the Biden administration has taken its first step to retaliate for China's broad hack of American telecommunications firms, moving to ban the few remaining operations of China Telecom in the United States. That's not what's happening here. This is not a response to Salt Typhoon. You talk to anyone who works in American SIGINT about China Telecom, and they've been trying to kick them out for, I don't know, at least half a decade, probably a decade, because
the hive of scum and villainy. That place.
Oh my God, the badness that emanates out of China Telecom. I'm amazed they haven't been yeeted until now. But people are desperate for a hook, desperate for an angle, and the New York Times, being the New York Times, has just written it up like this, which is just extremely misleading.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's been a long time coming, and the people we've thrown out of the industry before, people like Huawei, etc., that was a kind of an easier sell because it was more visible and a bit kind of more egregious. Whereas being a back end kind of telco, it's a bit less visible. I mean, people don't see Huawei shops and Huawei phones, so they don't you don't see that kind of thing with China Telecom. So yeah, it's taken a while to push through, but they didn't do a whole bunch. I mean, they had really been whittled down in the US over time. So, there weren't a lot of options.
Because using the PLA and MSS's telco of choice, allowing it to peer into American networks is probably not a great idea, right?
No. Oh dear. So good riddance, I guess. And I don't know what other Chinese telcos there are still operating in the US as well, but probably your time is up too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends where all of the villainy goes to, right? I think that's going to be the determining factor. I mean, China Telecom is not being kicked out because it's Chinese. China Telecom is being kicked out because that's where all the attacks come from. I think that's sigh. Anyway, we got one from Martin Matashak here over at The Record, and it's, congratulations to him, because this is absolutely a really great write-up and a great summary of what's going on, and it's looking at how under Trump, he planned to end the Cyber Command and NSA dual hat role, where the head of the NSA is also the head of Cyber Command. He introduced a plan in December 2020 to end the dual hat thing, and of course it didn't really happen because at that point he was a lame duck president. But it's back on the agenda, and it's probably going to happen. There are arguments for this. What's funny though is like probably he's not doing it for the right reasons. But it's gonna happen. I would expect sometime over the next 4 years. And I think, look, you can't make a determination on whether or not this is a good or a bad thing until you see how they're planning to implement it. Is it just going to be, different heads, or, like how separate are the organizations going to be? Because it's very clear that the reason they haven't done this already is because Cyber Command's not ready to stand on its own. So as long as they execute this right and there's like just different heads and they get the management bit of it right, it could work. But God, who knows? Right?
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thing with the whole Trump presidency coming in. There's quite a lot of, well, who knows? We're just going to have to wait and see how mad it actually is once they start implementing things. The relationship between the two, I guess, like from the outside is difficult to, like as an outsider, it's kind of difficult to judge how much disintegration there is between the two, or how much integration there is, and kind of to what extent this, as you said, like there are different ways they could implement this change, and how much effect that would have as an outsider is kind of hard to judge. So we are really just going to have to wait and see how it shapes up. But certainly people inside the IC have all sorts of varied opinions about it. So, if they don't know, then neither do we.
Well, look, I think the consensus from the people I speak to in the IC is that it's just what I said earlier. Cyber Command's not quite ready to stand on its own, which is why this hasn't happened. So, yeah, let's see what happens,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I did a great podcast with Chris Krebs. That was the one that we recorded live in Sydney. And some real interesting stuff there, all about China, and some interesting stuff there, some interesting insights about the approach to US cyber under Trump, and how it was, more aggressive, more defend forward, changes to NSPM 13 that allowed them to do things like target C2 nodes in, even in friendly countries and whatever. So I think we could see, and Chris said that the intelligence community part of Project 2025, which is the alleged policy roadmap for the Trump White House, the intelligence part of that is actually pretty good. The DoD stuff is different in tone, but the IC stuff is good. So, it's going to be a mixed bag. It's hard to look back on the Trump years and say that the cyber policy side was terrible, really. Yeah. Like, you had Rob Joyce writing the executive orders, and you had CISA stand up, and, a lot of good stuff, and changes to an SPM 13. So got to keep an open mind, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, I hope it goes well for all of us, because, it looks, there's quite a lot of crazy as well mixed up in this.
It makes it fun, all right? Let's just think of it that way. Accentuate the positive, Adam.
Interesting times.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the European Union has opened an investigation into TikTok over the Romanian election stuff that we talked about on the show, I think, last week. They'd already issued some sort of data and evidence preservation order to TikTok, but this is being taken very seriously in the EU, given that this is the first time we've had an election annulled over what was found to be unlawful interference by one of the candidates. But I spoke about this with our colleague Tom Uren on last week's Seriously Risky Business podcast. What were they thinking? Yeah. Like, why were they not on top of this? Because it probably wasn't like a state-directed thing, but it's just such incompetence to allow this to happen at such a critical time for the company.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very sensitive time, and this is absolutely not what they need right now. Staring down the barrel of a ban in the US, investigations in the EU. Like, it's a bad time to have these headlines, and a bad time, as you said, to have a historic annulling of an election. Like, that is not good. It's not good.
No, it's really not. And meanwhile, a detail, Catalin, of course, one of our colleagues, Catalin Kimpanu, he lives in Romania. He is Romanian, and I think there's now all of this anti-EU propaganda spreading on TikTok in Romania, saying that the EU had ordered the election be annulled.
Yeah, to undermine that's the Romanian democracy, and
yes. Yeah, so still up to it, and you would just think if you know what's good for you, you're going to stop this. And of course, by the time we come back in 2025, it's going to be around Trump's inauguration. Actually, we come back like a couple days before that, but like a day after. I think we come back on the day that TikTok is supposed to have been divested. So next time we talk, we're going to know a little bit more. Now, to some bread and butter infosec. And Clop is back, baby.
Yes, they have claimed responsibility for a bunch of the attacks against the Cleo file transfer servers that have been being breached over the last couple of weeks. They, of course, were the group behind Exxon and Go MFT and
Move It, most famously.
Move It,
yeah.
a bunch of other file transfer hacks, and they have a proven model for monetizing stealing data from file transfer systems, ransoming it off, and apparently they have stolen so much data that they have cleared out their darknet leak portal to make room. They ran out of disk space with all of the old leaks, so they've junked them all, said we're only working with new companies, which is a nice way of framing it, because they've stolen so much data through the Cleo bugs. And they said they've been using both the current Cleo bug and the earlier one this was initially the most recent one was written up as a variant of. Turns out actually that's not the case. It's a whole new bug. But yeah, clearly Clop have been quite busy.
Yeah, now initially, because there's been some bad reporting around this, because when we spoke about it last week, we were like, oh, they're exploiting a bug that was already patched and it wasn't patched correctly. It turns out that's not accurate. It is a new bug. Also, Huntress Labs were out there tying this to Termite, which is the ransomware crew that in turn is responsible for the Blue Yonder incident, right? So they're saying, we believe it's the same crew. Turns out not so much. It is Clop. There are also people saying, well, Blue Yonder ran a Cleo box on their edge, so maybe that's how they got ransomware, and that was, further meant to substantiate that Termite was behind this. It looks like that's not right. We've got Clop back now. I've heard from other sources that the team have filled me in on this, and they've spoken to their sources as well, that there's really nothing linking Termite to this campaign. But I wonder, I don't know because I haven't spoken to Huntress about it. I wonder if they've got a bit of intelligence that maybe ties some of these Clop people to the Termite people, because, it's all one big sort of soup of bad actors. But it certainly looks like that original take that it was a exploitation of a failed patch and tied to Termite. It looks like that was bad info.
Yeah, and I can kind of see why with the technical aspects of the bug, because there were quite a lot of similarities between the two. The first bug that was patched was a arbitrary unorthed file upload and also read, and the way it was exploited was by uploading a shell and then reading a password file off this to get to be able to trigger the file that had been uploaded to then execute, and that triggering process required auth. So they used the read to get auth and then the write to upload a shell and then cause it to be run. The second bug is only write, and it's quite closely related, but they have to use a different exploitation mechanism as well, which involves writing a configuration file that subsequently led to command execution that was processed automatically. So there was sort of a folder where you could drop configuration updates into, and they would get processed automatically. So a little bit of, very similar functionality, but slightly different, and a whole different bug. I think Rapid7 had a pretty good write-up of the specifics of the bug. And, it's classic Java, enterprise software where that's so over-architected and componentized that no one really knows what the validation logic looks like when you're writing it. So, standard sorts of bugs, but nice to actually have some concrete details now.
Yeah, so I've linked through to Lawrence Abrams' write-up for Bleeping Computer, and I've also linked through to a report from Jonathan Grieg, which looks at CISA, issuing warnings about this. I mean, I don't know if this will be as big as Move It, and but given the fact that we're shutting down this week and stuff, normally chaos normally reigns when we're off, probably will be, right?
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like Clop have been pretty busy. I mean, they were talking to Lawrence Abrams from Bleeping Computer and said, we have completed our project, which, in the past has meant pillaging all of the ones they could find on the internet and then starting to drop them. Yeah. So, we may be in for the traditional risky biz holiday times.
Well, it's funny, actually, because Clop say, well, we delete data from government agencies, from medical clinics and stuff like that. Which is, their policy, which I think, if you're going to be
responsible ransomware actors.
Well, it's not, it's data extortion. It kind of annoys me when those two things get conflated. But I think if you're going to do this, at least having some scruples, is, I don't know. I don't think it's bad, actually. I think that's fine. Yeah. But, in the John Grieg write-up, this is where we are, right? As an industry and as a discipline, where you've got CISA instructing civilian government agencies that they have to patch this by January 3. Come on, Adam. You and I both know how many of these are going to be left standing. by January 3, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Clop has probably already been through them all. I think probably CISA should be directing people to
100%.
roll incident response.
Yeah,
by January
100%.
3,
And,
maybe.
this is something that comes up time and time again. And it's great that CISA has the authority to demand that agencies do this stuff. But, like, it's too late.
It is too late.
Which is why, yeah, I mean, again, I'm on the board of a company that's doing, zero trusty style stuff to prevent people from being able to access these things in a pre-auth condition, right? Because again, that's that go-to line, which is for so long we've thought of authentication as access control, and it's not. Because pre-auth bugs exist.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with nasty Java enterpriseware like this. Ooh, boy.
And those bugs, like, and Rapid7 has a great analysis, and we've linked through to that one. You dug that one up. But these bugs, I know you, and I know where your skill set is. Like, you would have found these on a review. So. Like, what are they doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agreed. Like I enjoyed reading the Java. It's quite a nice throwback because I have read a lot of enterprise Java in my time, and this is exactly the sort of thing you find. Just threading the needle through the file upload handling, hitting disk, and Bob is your Java uncle.
I mean, most people listening to this would know, but Adam is a pen tester with over 20 years of experience, who's an old hand who's come up all the way through network and whatever, and has written DMA exploits and all sorts of stuff, but wound up with a bit of a specialty in Java, which is quite funny. Like, and it's a love-hate relationship.
Yeah,
It?
It's a deeply hate. I mean, I hate hack Java. Like it aggravates me so much that I want to punish it. And
but you're good at it.
Leads to good bug hunting. Yes. Also, it's easy. I mean, Java bugs tend to be pretty easy once you can read the Java, and not very many people have the patience or sickness necessary to read the Java.
I've seen him do it, folks. I've seen him do it. I've watched him do it, and he's very good. Now, look, talking about bugs that just get us owned, and this is another Emperor has no clothes moment, just like the last one, where it's like, hey, would you mind patching that by January 3rd, like weeks after they're all owned, and exploits are available. This is another one where what do you do about this, right? Which is there's another critical in Apache Struts, which, okay, if you're using Struts in some critical application that's well maintained, you'll just patch it and move on. But that's not where Struts tends to pop up, right? So this is going to be a perma bug, and it's a real dumb one that, frankly, it's very surprising that this one's like still there to be found. Walk us through it.
I mean, to answer your first question, what does one do? One gets wrecked is what one does
Yes.
about this. So Apache Struts, for those who are lucky enough not to be enterprise Java developers, is a framework used for building Java apps from the Apache Foundation, and it's very widely used. Like, it was one of the early kind of enterprise scale, robust web application frameworks for Java, and everybody uses it. And it has a lot of, risky functionality in it. This is a bug in the file upload handling, and honest to God, this is a straight up path traversal, write file through the upload handler thing that is just, bugs like that really shouldn't exist in this day and age, but they do. And Struts has had bugs like this in the past, and it probably will continue to have them in the future, clearly. But the really hard thing about this is what the way that they've patched this is by deprecating the file upload handler, like piece of code, the controller that handles file uploads, and saying, just don't use this. We built a new, better one that's more robust, and hopefully it is. But the problem is, this is not a patch. This is replace the file upload handling mechanism in your application and recompile. And if you don't have access to the source, or you don't maintain the source, or you're using an appliance that happens to use Struts on the inside that's out of support, or you can't get a patch from the vendor, or the vendor might not patch for months, you're just screwed, and you can't put the stuff on the internet and survive. There's already exploit code out there. Like, this is, I mean, it really is, if you can find the file upload handler, then you can ... your way to upright kind of level thing. So there's code out there to do this, to test it, to discover them. You're just going to have a bad time. And we saw Struts as the root cause for a heap of bugs in VMware products, for example. So if you are one of the customers that no longer has a great relationship with VMware's owner Broadcom, and you're not expecting to get patches from that, well, tough.
Yeah.
So, and there's just like, there is so much banking and middleware and all sorts of things that use Struts that the source code's long gone, right? There's no development team anymore. It's abandoned. It's never going to get recompiled and updated. and there's nothing you can do about it except not put it on the internet.
Yeah. And watch it like a hawk if your internal network has enough sufficient scale that that's something you need to worry about, right?
I mean, yeah, bad times.
Definitely bad times all around. But again, it's an emperor has no clothes moment, because we've got good at some stuff. I feel like, you know, I'm in a reflective mood, right? It's the last show of the year. We've got reasonably good at defending Windows networks, for example. You know, and I think we can thank, people love to crap on EDR, but properly configured EDR, you know, gets you a long way running a Windows network. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you don't really have to worry about anymore. An attacker is only going to get so far before they get snapped and evicted. And, you know, you got these all singing, all dancing orchestration solutions to re-image boxes and whatever. I feel like for the first time in a long time, it is possible with a reasonable amount of effort to run a reasonably secure Windows environment. But then all this sort of stuff's out there. You know, your file transfer bug, you know, file transfer appliance bug that you just talked about is an embarrassment. And then you've got this stuff in Apache Struts, which is a framework for making appliances and all sorts of other stuff. And that's an embarrassment. And you can't just roll EDR for this. You know, there's no simple solution here.
No, there isn't. And I mean, you know, the Struts and Java in general, pretty cross-platform. So it crops up on Unix boxes, it crops up on Windows boxes, you know, it gets into all sorts of places. And there aren't, you know, consistent controls like EDR on non-Windows platforms, right? There are products, but they're not consistently deployed. They're not consistently reliable. They don't have the kind of depth. Even incident response on non-Windows platforms, you know, the tooling is just not as mature. The expertise is not as mature. Like, it's still, you know, I guess I'm reflective too, and in the other way, like, it's all terrible still.
Yeah.
Different terrible, which I'm glad for, because it'd be a boring career if it was the same terrible, you know, every day for 20 years. But
well, and I think we're going to see more attacks targeting stuff like this that aren't just smash and grab, like data extortion, ransomware, whatever. So you look at like Salt Typhoon, there's no CSRB report yet, but when that lands, it's going to show us that the attackers did not come in via the Windows networks. They came in through owning Linux boxes, owning old telco switches, owning a bunch of, you know, pizza box rack mountable crap loaded up with stuff like struts. Like, I know, I can feel it. I can feel it in my waters that's what that report is going to look like.
That's how I owned telcos, right? Yeah. I don't like Windows boxes. I don't want to own Windows users. Like, that's a terrible place to be in the network. I would much rather own Unix boxes and have a good time.
So after a long time working on sorting out like big deal, you know, custom web applications and stuff and Windows networks and whatever, like, this is the stuff that's looking juicy again. And I just think in 2025, we're going to see more of it. Yeah, now, a report from Darina Antoniuk over at The Record. Some Japanese game and anime publisher has paid $3 million to a bunch of hackers in Russia. Now, this on its own, whatever, it's a day of the week sort of story. I think Japan could be in for a rough time. And I've seen people on social media at various points over this year sort of float a similar idea, where you've got a country with a $4.2 trillion GDP, some very large companies, and a surprisingly immature cybersecurity posture. Yeah. And I have a feeling that once these attackers figure it out, I think Japan could be heading for some ransomware drama. And I also think that there are other motivations to go after companies outside of the Five Eyes Alliance, in that, you know, word on the street is that the counter-ransomware operations by the Five Eyes agencies are ongoing and actually showing some success. So I think, you know, staying away from those countries, if you're an attacker, would be the prudent thing to do. Japan just looks like a great target, is what I'm getting at.
It does, yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And I think, you know, I think back to some of the hacks we've seen of, you know, like weird for us, like Japanese specific applications for, like, you know, government document sharing and other bits and pieces where, you know, we've seen like Chinese intelligence and other people busting into Japanese government and big, you know, Japanese corporations through really quite, you know, bugs that are not technically, you know, crazy, but like they're in bits of software that are kind of crazy. So I think it's a pretty target-rich environment. The language barrier has bought them some things, but
well, not now because of freaking AI, man. You can do good
translation and stuff has gotten good enough that, you know, that's not as much of an insulating factor as it once was. So yeah, I think Japan's a great target.
I mean, when everyone was saying that AI was going to turbocharge cybercrime, I don't think they realized it was just because it would allow ransomware actors to negotiate with like Japanese victims, right? But it's probably where we are.
Yeah.
God, it's been a couple of years now, hasn't it, since ChatGPT? When did they release that?
Yeah, I guess I suppose it has been it somehow
It's been a
seems
little
longer
while
than
now.
that.
We still have jobs, right? Remember when it was going to replace all journalists and, anyway.
I think anyone who's actually used those things for serious work will discover why it has not replaced journalists.
No, I mean, it's and it's funny because I always said it's a better Siri, right? Remember I said that on the show a bunch of times. That's what I thought it was. It was a better Siri, a better interface. And what's really funny is now I'm using Apple Intelligence, which allows you to get Siri to interact with ChatGPT. So it literally is a better Siri at this point. So I feel like, yep, called that one. Moving on to this piece from AJ Vicens over at Reuters. And an American firm and a US investment group has acquired an Israeli spyware vendor called Paragon, which is a competitor to NSO Group. I think this is good news. Interestingly enough, though, this company, like it has a it claims that it's very serious about who it does business with. In job listings, it says that it applies strict moral restrictions on itself and only works with government agencies that meet the standards of an enlightened democracy. So rather than just going for growth, as NSA did, it seems like they've taken more of the Azimuth style approach, which is to be very careful about who they work with. And as a result, there's an acquisition here for, I think it's $500 million and then like another $400 million in incentives. So a total deal worth about $900 million. And this is great because we're seeing a reward for a company that's kind of doing business the right way. And now it's going to be overseen, by a US interest where the US government will have more oversight, over an American company. And we've got to find jobs for all of these very talented people in Israel, because if they don't get folded into quote unquote our system, they're going to work somewhere. And it might be for the next NSO style company that's selling all of its stuff to God knows who. So in my mind, this is a positive story.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, I know that we have listeners who are of the opinion that all spyware is bad. Like the capability itself is too tempting to not be abused. But I think you are right. Like much like we, gave jobs to Nazi rocket scientists or ex-Russian, weapons developers or stuff at the end of the Cold War to stop them from going and working for everybody else. Because like you look at the source of...
Hey guys, how about we try to go to the moon instead?
Yes, yeah, exactly. You guys love that.
Yeah.
But you look at the state of like, say, nuclear proliferation and how few really expert people it can take to bootstrap entire separate proliferation risks. And I'm thinking of Aku Khan, I think it was the Pakistani guy. So I think I think this is a smart move, and keeping the stuff inside the fold is great. And yeah, you're right. As a reward for doing this better than NSO Group, $1 trillion, $1 billion or whatever, ends up being worth, like that's a good carrot for other people who are considering it. And NSO got the stick. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, briefly, it looked like L3Harris were going to buy NSO Group. And I think that was actually an initiative that might have emanated from within certain agencies of the US government. But then when the White House caught wind of it, they crushed it. Yeah. And I think it really was at the point where there would have been some positives in that you would have had all of that talent all of a sudden working in a way that was more closely aligned with US interests, which would have been a positive. But then there's the rewarding bad behavior component, which is why I think they actually killed it. So it was more of an ideological decision than a pragmatic one. And I can go either way. I can argue either way on that one. But now we've seen this, and this is a good thing. And hopefully this will, and they're not doing this. This company that bought them is not doing it as a way to improve our world. They're doing it for dollars. But I just like seeing when the sanctions and whatever have sort of punished NSO, and now here's a group who did it differently who are getting rewarded. I think it's a sign that government settings around this stuff are actually working.
Yeah, I mean,
and how often can you say that?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Right? You may not necessarily agree with this being an uncomplicated good thing, but I think we can agree that this is a better outcome than what we've seen in the past. Like, it's a step in the right direction, I think, even if it's imperfect.
Yeah, well, Israeli hackers and exploit devs are going to hack an exploit dev. So
Yes.
I think it's better if they are doing that within a framework that is more conducive to human rights and those sort of things, right? Funny that. So let's look at a story from Krebs on security now. And he's taken a look at the Canada Nexus of crypto money laundering. Like, I don't think there's an easy way to summarize this piece, because you and I were talking before we got recording, and it is dense. It is extremely dense. But the upshot is there's a whole bunch of like fairly shady looking crypto services and money remittance, providers that are all based out of a single address in Vancouver. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's like thousands of these places, and they're often sharing addresses, and the registrations are funny and whatever. And it's just a fascinating look into how some of this money moves around, and also the nexus with doing business with sanctioned Russian banks and whatever. It's just, it's great work. How did you find this?
Yeah, no, it is. It's really interesting because the mechanics of moving money around are kind of opaque and constantly shifting. And so it's always interesting to see, what's the current state of the art look like. So for example, some of these organizations were cryptocurrency, kind of brokers or agents or whatever that would spin up new wallets for every transaction and all sorts of things to try and make it, possible to do the laundering across the blockchain. So that's interesting, that part of it. And then there's all of the shell companies and all of the ways that you kind of hide it from accountability. And you do have to wonder about what exactly are the Canadian regulators doing when, there's 122 money services businesses in one building that contains a massage therapy clinic.
Yeah.
Probably not exactly legit. And then Krebs ties this through to a bunch of similarly named companies or companies with similar directors or agents or whatever else in the UK. And then there's other ones in Europe. And it just turns into that full, crazy map on the wall with lots of string connecting important points, the sort of thing that you imagine Brian Krebs's office probably looks like.
Yeah, he was profiled recently by one of the broadsheet newspapers, and he had the journos and their photographer leave their phones at home when coming to his house. He'd previously been swatted. He's moved somewhere, very undisclosed sort of location. And when he's writing stories like this, you see why it's not just paranoia, So we've linked through anyway. Go have a read. It's just a really interesting story that sort of peels back the curtain on something that's normally, quite well hidden.
Yeah, and you end up in like the Western Sahara Central Reserve, and it's just, it's a wild ride.
It is. Now we got one from Cyberscoop by Greg Otto, looking at this guy called Baron Martin, who's 20 years old. He's from Tucson, Arizona, and he was arrested on charges of producing child sex abuse material and cyber stalking. But his arrest is connected with these, what they're describing as online terror networks, specifically one called 764 and another called CVLT. And I think they're kind of offshoots of the com, or in that part of that whole mix. And you think, cyber terrorism's not real. Don't be ridiculous. And then you read this and you're like, cyber terrorism's real.
Yeah, there's some pretty horrible stuff in here. And also so young, 20 years old, and doing all this kind of real nasty stuff.
Yeah. These guys, that's the thing, right? The underground, back in our day, right?
Yeah.
Might look at spam, carding, hacking for exploits or whatever was more, I don't know, was that grey hat, whatever. But it was, even the serious stuff was a little bit more tame. These guys are psychopaths. Yeah.
Really, exactly. Like that juxtaposition, definitely feels very strong. And I think, I didn't roll with a particularly bad crowd as a teenager, but, even amongst the people I knew, there was no one doing worse than, carding a pizza maybe, or...
I knew a few doing carding for profit, right? Or people who had done that. And, that's about getting paid. And people who are doing that would sort of see it as a bit of a victimless crime because it was spread, the people who are losing the money could afford it. They were large corporations, right? But this is, and they say that this network is noted for its use of cybercriminal tactics and manipulation of societal norms to exploit minors, guided by a broader agenda of societal chaos. So I think that's why they're sort of treating these people as terrorists, because they seem to want to bring it all down.
Yeah. Well, this guy, Baron Martin, he went by the alias Convict.
Yes.
So rather foreshadowing there, buddy.
Yeah, so he could face up to 30 years in prison. But these are the people who are coercing people into doing self-harm on video and whatever. It's like kids as young as 10. So anyway, let's see what the future brings in terms of categorizing these people as terrorists and locking them up for a long time, and whether or not that has any impact whatsoever on unlocking further law enforcement resources to go after these groups as networks. And yeah, I don't know. That's another thing to look out for in 2025, because you get this sense that authorities are onto this now and they're taking it seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
Another one from Dorina at the record, and Russia has blocked and banned Viber, which is a Japanese sort of voice over IP and messaging app, and they're claiming it facilitates terrorism and drug trafficking. Who knows if that's the real reason? Probably not, is my feeling.
Yeah, and Viber apparently is actually quite big, or was quite big in Russia. It was the third most popular messaging app after like Telegram and
WhatsApp and Telegram. Yeah,
WhatsApp. Yeah, so like that's pretty big. And we've seen restrictions against on WhatsApp as well in Russia here and there. Like they haven't been consistent, but they're definitely cracking down, and they cracked down on VPNs for circumventing some of these restrictions. Are also changing the game a bit in Russia. Like it's a pretty tough time to be on the internet there, and to want to be able to communicate without being surveilled or being seen or being tracked.
Well, I mean, you've still got options, right? WhatsApp is a reasonable option, but I wonder how long it's going to be before Russia launches a reskinned version of WeChat that Xi hands over the source, and it's congratulations, get on WeChat. Like it's coming. You can feel it.
Definitely, yeah. You definitely feels that way, because they have to keep kind of cranking the handles on control there, because, Putin's feeling threatened. So, yeah, well,
Putin is threatened. I mean, the economy there is really not doing well at all. And the slide appears to be accelerating. The only thing keeping the ruble, keeping it at all buoyant is a whole bunch of controls on foreign exchange trading that the Russian central bank introduced. Like, things are looking pretty bad there. Whether or not that leads to a collapse in Putin's government, I mean, that's something different. I mean, I was having this conversation with a friend recently, and they pointed out that, the Turkish economy experienced extreme inflation and all sorts of issues as well, and Erdogan survived. So we don't know what's going to happen over there, but certainly, things in Russia are not as good as they were a few years ago. For sure.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. And Russia is, that conflict is just, it's so harrowing to keep watching all of the updates. I mean, we get so much, kind of insight into what's going on over there, and it's just, it's pretty horrific.
Yeah, well, a current update is North Koreans, shooting at drones instead of running away from them and getting mowed down in open fields. Like, it's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. But, mate, that is actually it for this week's news, and that's actually it for us, for you and me, for 2024. Do we do a star rating for the year? Like, is this like Yelp? I'd give it a 4-star.
You think 4-star? I mean, there's definitely been a lot of interesting stuff to talk about this year, and there's been a bunch of great hacks. And I think the thing that really stood out for me this year is the sheer scale of I suppose we're not supposed to call it pig butchering anymore. Interpol asked us not to call it pig butchering.
Because it stigmatizes the victims. Fair enough, too.
Which, fair enough.
Don't call the victims pigs, that are getting butchered. I think that's, we can all be a little bit more sensitive.
We could, absolutely. But yeah, the scale of that in Southeast Asia, that's a thing that whenever I explain it to other people who are, not in the industry, friends and family and stuff, people are like, what? You mean like thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are enslaved? I assumed this was all, willing hackers, ripping people off and running romance scams, and not victims of human trafficking and, enslavement. So that, for me, I think has just been that's not a thing I would have predicted, 5 years ago when we were wrapping up the year.
That's your big, I don't even know what my big takeaway from the year is, man. People will say, wow, that conversation you had 2 weeks ago about XYZ was really interesting. I don't even remember it. I'm like, did I talk about that? I knew I was thinking about it, but I couldn't remember. But mate, we'll wrap it up there. Wonderful year. Looking forward already to joining you again in 2025, my friend. Have a great summer. Have a great break.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. And I wish everybody, Pat, yourself, a great break, and all of our listeners. And yeah, feel free to come check out our new website.
That was Adam Boileau there with the final news discussion for 2024. Big thanks to him for that, and big thanks to all he's done for us this year, including developing the back end of our new website, and taking on a lot of the work that I used to have to do as well. It's great to have him on board. It is time for this week's sponsor interview now with Robbie Winchester, who works for the services part of SpectreOps, which of course also makes the Bloodhound Enterprise attack path enumeration tool, which is fantastic. If you don't know it, just go and Google for Bloodhound Enterprise. But Robbie joined me for this interview, which is all about how pen testing has changed, what buyers are looking for out of pen tests these days, and so on and so forth. So I'll drop you in here where Robbie explains to us, the answer to the question of, well, what's changed? Here he is.
It's simultaneously a lot of the same, because I guarantee that Windows XP still has a beating CPU somewhere in someone's network, and certain things never can really fully die. But there's a lot of new emerging issues and threats, especially around, or things to be concerned with, especially with the new adoption of services, like cloud services and cloud integration, migration to the kind of identity focus. And it's tough to keep track of when you're going and building all that out. What risk are you accepting? What are you provisioning? How is it working? Is it set up the way you think it's set up? And oftentimes, especially with some of the remote or cloud type services, as new features or capabilities are added, is that adding different things from when you configured it, that maybe you're adding additional risk and you're not aware of it, because when you set it up, there was A, B, and C, and now there's A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you didn't go back and update for those new additions. So it's kind of an emerging threat of this hybrid, growing, sprawling, difficult to kind of grasp network at times.
Well, where you're not the admin and you don't really control
Right.
the box, right? So that's, how do you even supposed to get on top of that? I suppose you call in some pen testers and they go and beat you up and show you, hey, they introduced this new feature 4 months ago and you didn't know about it.
Right. Well, and especially if you have, do you have an identity team and a cloud team and a data analytics team and all these different parts of the organization? So like you said, is it hard to find that central belly button for who knows the whole picture?
Yeah. Well, that is tough.
Yeah.
But it also sounds, you did say something interesting there, which is, there's always these hype claims that come out in security where people say X is the new Y.
Yeah.
But identity is the new perimeter. I'm kind of sympathetic to that one, because it really does feel like that's where the action is these days.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of core of our perspective. Bloodhound Enterprise is big, and just Bloodhound in general is big about understanding the identity and the attack path problem. And we see this a lot in all of our testing services, where it's not just finding, or I shouldn't say it's not finding a vulnerability and taking advantage of an exploit like potentially 08067 Windows back in the day. It's keeping track of and what are the different permissions that are attributed to all these different sprawling identity providers and identity implementations, and not realizing that a person or a computer or a group can access all these other things that are not necessary. And especially when you go from the complexities of your local computer, and then I have sessions in my browser, and are each of those sessions protected, or can I hijack a browser session? And so now everything you're logged into in the cloud is potentially exposed. So it opens up a very interesting kind of new frontier of this big identity centric. It's not a patching problem. This is how computers work.
Well, and you've got all of these sort of OAuth style applications that are essentially, just offer limitless privilege escalation opportunities in the cloud as well. So, it is possible sometimes to go from a fairly low privileged user through one of these apps that's got way too much access to everything and normal users can interact with. I mean, I'm guessing you spend a lot of time there, right?
Yeah, well, and again, it's part of the challenge is, the easiest way to enroll and onboard and do anything, just like in computers networks back in the day, the easiest way to make everyone be able to do anything they want on their computer is to make them a local admin. And so over permissive entitlements, overly permissive, granting of privileges is kind of an endemic. It's a human problem of it just makes it easier when you have more access than you need, because then you're not butting up against that just enough. And it's hard to figure out what is that just enough.
So this begs the question then, is the market sort of across this, like what type of assessments are the most popular at the moment coming from, I mean, SpectreOps is known as a good pen test red team shop, right? So I'm guessing, you would attract customers who are at the more serious end of the type of people who buy those services. Like what are their purchasing habits telling us about how much they actually understand about, the risks that they face?
Yeah, it definitely varies. I think a lot of it is the perspective is going to change very differently between companies who've felt the pain firsthand. So if they've dealt with a compromise, they've dealt with an incident, and they have firsthand knowledge and experience of how painful, frustrating, confusing that can be. That's obviously going to change their perspective in some ways. I'd say in general, the kind of trend that we're seeing is, and this is where we try and focus and operate, is less on proving that you can get access. So we're not as much trying, or our main focus is not around specifically the phishing or trying to break in through a web application or crack passwords to get in from the outside.
It's less about capturing a flag. It's more about sitting down and looking at how things are set up.
Right. And answering that question.
I'm sorry to cut you off there, but I got a friend here in Australia, or someone I know in Australia, who tried to start a business they're ex-SIGINT, and they tried to start a business doing that 12, 15 years ago, and just no one was interested. So they just wound up doing capture the flag style pen tests and red teams. But I'm guessing, from what you're telling me, because it was a good idea then, it's still a good idea, but what you're saying, people are actually buying that now.
Yeah, and you have to have a certain, it's tough because I don't think that those things are not important. It's just only part of the problem. People will click on phishing emails. There will be vulnerabilities. There will be 0 days. That's all going to exist. Credentials are going to get leaked. So that's kind of that assumed breach mentality, which has become more and more accepted, I would say.
Yeah.
And so it's valuable.
Well, I mean, that's on a similar trajectory as this idea that all vulnerabilities in your organization should be patched. And finally, people are like, okay, we can let go of that as an aspiration because it's completely unrealistic. And I think what you're saying is now there's a bit more of a realistic mindset creeping into enterprise understanding of how this all works.
Yeah, and I think it's also I think to a certain extent, like if you're practicing for any sport, football, be it my American version or the European version, doesn't matter. Any type of football, every time you practice, you don't just play full games and have to start and do 90 minutes, and then if you want to practice a corner kick or a penalty kick or whatever. You don't only have to do that in the course of when it happens in a game. You control practice time, so you can go and set up different scenarios and set up certain circumstances. And so I think that's kind of the attitude to a certain extent with the offensive services of let's not just try and do everything from I have to send an email, the user has to click it, we have to go through, but let's figure out what are those specific areas or scenarios or things that we're worried about, and then can we demonstrate and provide something that might not happen all the time in a real world scenario or a real world situation, but it's something you're really worried about. Let's practice that in a controlled environment where there isn't actual risk. And then you get to know, are things working how I think they are? Am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Oftentimes there's one understanding of how things exist. And then when the pen tester does the
generating some traffic and trying to have a look to see if it falls out the other side of a detection stack is a good idea. I mean, I've always thought this sort of approach is better, where you get some specialists to come in, they look at your apps, they look at your services, they look at your network diagrams, and they say, okay, here would be a pretty good place to have a shell. Let's pop a shell there,
right?
And you don't need to go and do the recon and the exploitation and the phishing because it's just a bunch of wasted time. But let's give one of our people a shell there, and let them go wild for a little bit and see what pops out of the detections and whatever. And it's just, it's better bang for buck, right? I feel like we've spent so much time as an industry, wasted dollars, wasted hours just on that bit of getting the shell on that box, which isn't really the important bit.
Well, you can test that in so many more effective ways as a standalone circumstance of, can I, if I want to test, for example, phishing, if you break that down, we had one of our, team members wrote a blog post a while ago, but basically talking about if you break down what is the phishing challenge you're trying to answer, you can kind of decompose that into what are users going to click something, and you don't have to have a payload execute to figure out if users will click on something they shouldn't, be it an attachment or a link. You can design that where there's no risk, and that's an easy thing to test. You can see are things getting delivered through my stack that I don't want to get delivered. You can test that just going to a sample email box. You don't have to go and do a full thing. And then once something does get delivered, if I'm curious about will it actually detonate or call out or do something on the endpoint, if we take this kind of combined problem of doing phishing, we can break it down into these elements and then better test each of those individual things. Not that it's not a valuable circumstance, but why kind of test some of them some of the time instead of deliberately testing it?
So is this the most sort of popular assessment type that you're doing now?
I'd say for us, what we're typically doing is more of a objective focused red team or pen test. And predominantly it's just going to be based on, are we trying to evade detection? Are we trying to kind of go low and slower? Or are we trying to just identify from that starting point? Not necessarily smash and grab, but we're not conscious of the noise that we would make. Or if we run into a challenge, we're wanting to kind of document and move on of, okay, this thing stopped us, but if it didn't, this is the next step. And so it's taking more of, we kind of try and focus all of our assessments more in that objective of, what are you worried about? Are you worried about a user becoming a domain admin? Are you worried about sensitive information leaving the system or leaving the environment? Are you worried about financial institutions? Like, can I get into or touch ACH, Swift, some type of sensitive system? Information companies where they have their crown jewel secrets of, this is the proprietary stuff we don't want anyone to get to and no one should be able to. Can you get here? And so we try and start from that perspective and then work towards answering that question instead of going through kind of the more, you call it the CTF, but like the compliance style of, we're scanning things, we're looking for things that are open, we're checking through, we got to the end of the list, and then we provide a report card and move on.
Yeah. So I'm guessing most of your staff are pretty au fait with Bloodhound, though, right? And that doing this sort of identities graph based analysis is something that you would get with most of your assessments.
Yeah, in general, especially when we're operating in like a Windows enterprise, I mean, there's a reason a lot of companies, and not just us, use especially the community edition version of Bloodhound for that. I have access here, I want to get there mapping. It does get interesting. We have some of our customers who are Bloodhound Enterprise customers, and then we also do red team or penetration test, and that does kind of change the perspective because it's less an easy way to privilege escalate to domain admin or take over the enterprise, and the focus is a lot more than kind of in that objective of potentially even elevating as much as we need to, and just can we move in a way that is not triggering those detections. There's also a lot of interesting new Windows is both new and old constantly. So we've done a lot of research. Some of our team members done a lot of research on SCCM, both some new features and things that have come out, and then also it even also will go forward into some of the Intune and just the general whole device management process, where it's a similar challenge or a similar perspective, I would say, to that identity, where if you implement everything the right way, as Microsoft designed it, then you're probably going to be mostly okay. But some of the stuff is maybe confusing, or it's not as clear how you should implement it. And then
I heard a story of someone doing IR here in Australia for a large enterprise, and it wasn't related to the incident, but they discovered that every single 365 user was an Intune admin.
Right.
And that was like, whoa, okay, that's not great.
Well, and it's not a problem until it's a huge problem.
Until
that's kind of part of the problem.
Yeah.
And for some of those features and stuff, it's again, and that's the challenge of that as you go into the cloud. If you don't use Intune, and you could see that and just have you're very familiar with SCCM, let's say, but you just haven't happened to come across or mess with Intune, and you see that and you don't think anything of it. You think it's some media player, I don't know, and you just okay, this is fine.
So there you go. If you're after some red teaming / pen testing / OffSec, consulting against your network that isn't just capture the flag based kind of silliness, which, I mean, I know there's a place for that as well, but
absolutely,
it's nice to see people offering different services these days. You can get in touch with SpectreOps. One thing we'll quickly mention is you're having a conference next year, March 31st in Arlington, Virginia, 2-day main conference, and then you're going to have some 4-day trainings. I'm guessing that's going to focus on, OffSec and with an emphasis on Bloodhound as well.
Yeah, so we had an open CFP, got a lot of really interesting applications. Super looking forward to that. We should be announcing the exact talk list here pretty soon. But predominantly, again, that identity and attack path type focus is really kind of what we're going for there. And then the training classes we have are Red Team Operations. We have a new identity-driven operations tradecraft, or operational tradecraft, or operator tradecraft. I'm not sure. But it's an identity-driven course centric. It's kind of an evolution of the Red Team Operations course, acknowledging all of these new identity-centric challenges with the cloud and Entra and Okta and some of the like other types of implementations that are there. So yeah, very, very exciting. Should be a good time.
Should be a good one. All right, so that is SoCon, SO-Con 2025 by SpectreOps, and I'm sure I've given you enough information, dear listeners, that you may Google that one. Robbie Winchester, thank you so much for joining me for that conversation. Very interesting stuff.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. Appreciate it.
That was Robbie Winchester from SpectreOps there with this week's sponsor interview. Big thanks to him for that. Big thanks to SpectreOps for being a Risky Business sponsor. And that is it for 2024. I do hope you've enjoyed being with us through the whole year. It's been a fun one. It always is. And we will be returning for our 19th season in 2025. And I look forward to talking to you all then. Have a great break. Have a great Christmas. Have a great New Year's. And I'll catch you all next year. Cheers.